Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Mathieu. Tonight I want to welcome back to the show Matt LaCroix. He published his first book at the age of 22 and began studying history, philosophy, quantum mechanics, and superstring theory. His focus became uncovering and connecting the esoteric teachings from secret societies and ancient cultures that disappeared long ago in our past. At 32, he published his second book, The Illusion of Us, which combined years of research to discover the truth about history, human origins, as well as the fundamentals of consciousness. In 2019, he released his third book entitled The Stage of Time, which we will be discussing today. Matt, welcome back. How are you doing today?
Great, Chris. I love our discussions. I'm really looking forward to sitting down and really talking about some of this forbidden information, right?
Yes, I've definitely been looking forward to this. Every time I have you on, it's a fascinating show. You're a wealth of information, and today we're going to dive back into some of my favorite topics: hidden history, consciousness, the nature of reality, and that's a great place to start. Consciousness and the nature of reality. It's the first chapter of your book, and I believe it's one of the most important parts of our existence that we can explore. So what can you tell us about consciousness and the nature of reality?
Thanks, Chris. I wanted to start in the stage of time by sort of setting the stage for how do we perceive our reality, and perhaps if we're perceiving our reality incorrectly based on what a lot of the ancients talked about with how they perceive certain aspects of reality. And that's what we'll get into is talking about the idea of, like I discuss frequently, when you try to define what it is that we can label the human experience as, what defines us as like the physical body, the mortal physical body we see before us, or something that goes much deeper, something that goes on more of an infinite, eternal, conscious energy that never really dies. And that's what, when we start looking into the base layers of what defines reality itself, we find out that everything is just based on different vibrational frequencies, and that just like the famous quote goes, energy cannot be destroyed or created, it simply changes state. And I think that speaks volumes to how we can perceive things like mortality and dying and incarnation and sentient life and all those things. Because really we're in this strange place we find ourselves in when we open up our eyes in the morning. We wipe back the grogginess and we look around and we see something that maybe is very familiar at this point. After 20, 30, 40 years or whatever it is, you've woken up to that every day and you take it for granted. But really, what are you looking at? Well, you're looking at how we are perceiving the reality around us based on our limited senses, based on this, 7 colors in the visible light spectrum, where it creates this aspect of what we consider the nature of reality. And we look at that and we define everything based on generations of everyone that came before us that helped define it for us intentionally. So when we think of how we want to view everything, whether or not it's just history or our own, what defines our the experience we're having right now, our human origins, where we came from, perceiving the universe, everything has been sort of handed to us. It's been given to us, and we've been told what to think and what to believe. And this is the way something is, and this is the way something isn't. But what if that's not true? What if there are certain aspects of our reality that have been deliberately misled and suppressed and hidden from us, just because it would disrupt this delicate paradigm we have here, where people get up and they fight the grogginess and they get in the shower and they get to work and they work all day long and they come home and they're completely exhausted and drained and they just lay in front of the TV or whatever most people commonly do to just unwind from a whole day of using their energy. And then this does that in a cycle over and over again, right? And we get a little bit of time on the weekends, but people can't just go out and spend the tremendous amount of time that's needed to uncover these secrets of the nature of reality in our past, because number one, they don't have time, And number two, they don't really, in many cases, they don't really know that they're not privy with some massive piece of information that exists out there, because it has been very much suppressed and hidden. And I think that's where the first chapter really tries to delve into, is talking about how, well, look, these ancient cultures that came before us, they weren't just primitive like a lot of times we've been perceived as. There was sophistication in some ways that we don't even have, understanding of our planet, energy cycles, ley lines, the universe around us, and how zodiacal ages play into different time periods and energy. You know, we've lost sight of all those things. We've become so driven and focused by the illusions of the material world and the deceptions that keep us all entertained all the time, that it's very difficult to break out of that mentality and to try to seek things that maybe in many ways you don't even know are there to seek. So when your channel is called Forbidden News, and I really do feel that that's a great title, because a lot of this information, and the people hate the idea of, a lot of people roll their eyes when you bring up the idea of a conspiracy theory, but just look at all this information. It's just sitting there, and most people are completely unaware of it, because it's one of those things that's pushed down to the side, and people will maybe start to look into it, and then other people will start laughing and making fun of them, and then they'll quickly just, okay, never mind, that was kind of silly, right? When are you going to grow up past that mentality? When are you going to start looking into, whatever it is, and they make fun of you, and then people just quit. But we have to realize that is the true purpose of this experience here. It's to grow on a level where we can become more aware of the universe and the past that has preceded us, and be able to really grow on these fundamental levels that go far beyond just gaining material wealth and having a comfortable home to die in. This goes far beyond that. This goes to the very heart of us breaking out of this control system mentality here, to break free and always show that portrayal of getting wings, where you reach higher states and you all of a sudden rise above from all the silly distractions and reach higher stages of energy, right?
Definitely. Yeah, I agree 100%. And you're right. This information has been suppressed for so long. I think that, the knowledge of ourself and everything that's tied to it is a threat to certain factions here. But what's encouraging to me is the past few years, especially, I've been seeing a major awakening among people that, they're seeking out this knowledge, and a lot of it is coming to light. A lot of things are coming forward because of people like yourself bringing this to light. And thank you so much for the research you do, and it's fascinating to see where we're going in the time we're at right now.
It really is. This is an amazingly exciting time to be here, when the gates of knowledge are seemingly wide open. But at the same time, this war over information is helping to keep people in certain compartments of thinking, right? Where, oh my gosh, look, you could just go home today and spend an hour and just go online and or pick up some ancient book or whatever it is that teaches about what we're doing here, what all the nature of reality is, ancient history, whatever it is, these esoteric topics that are not discussed on a daily basis, these designated topics that we have to stay focused on all the time. I'm so bored of that. I was recently at a party, and I remember thinking to myself over and over again, this common mentality. It's like, I am so bad at small talk, because the things that I want to talk about, nobody else wants to talk about. And they start rolling their eyes, right? And when you start talking about it with them, you're like, hey, did you know that there's a lot of evidence around the world that there was an ancient civilization that was destroyed during the last ice age? And you see people go, oh yeah, that's interesting, right? And then they sort of gloss over and they look away and
get the awkward smiles.
What is the matter with you? Why don't you even keep your mind open to the idea of looking into these topics where there is credibility and evidence? But because of that, paradigm we control within us about having an idea of everything that defines reality, people are in most cases unwilling to accept or even contemplate some of these ideas and these topics that go beyond the mainstream. But in this age of kind of two things going on, right? The age of when this zodiac change is occurring, where we're reaching this higher vibrational frequency, just like the Mayans talked about, how human consciousness would eventually reach a point where our vibrational frequency, meaning, you know, our ability to reach higher states of awareness and energy, is so high that you can't keep that lid anymore on this information. And so people all over the place are waking up all around the world at different stages and because of different reasons. But the underlying thing that really is, I think, setting this whole thing off, it's not really books. See, as much as I love books, and I think books are a critical component in this, sitting down and reading a book and then contemplating that information is incredibly important. And I think that has a very important place in this. But what seems to be the really big catalyst that's just skyrocketing this entire thing is the internet. And it's the availability for people to be able to listen to something, even if, and they don't necessarily have the time to, I got to go out and, you know, read a 300-page book to try to understand something. You know, we're in that type of society now where it's go, 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 go. We need the information fast and quick. I don't have time to, you know, put myself out there if it's not something I'm going to get something back from. So I love the two components of what are going on. Some people will shrug at the loss of books and think that it's the end of everything. But I just see this as having both components, having books and cuneiform tablets, but also this ability for people to just open up YouTube and watch one of these videos. This is changing the paradigm, because it's no longer just these designated TV shows that we can only watch and these books that we're giving in a curriculum that we can only read. You know, people are going home and even if they don't want to necessarily tell others, they're secretly researching this stuff for themselves. You know, they're sitting there with their mind blown, going to work. And then, you know, you're like, boy, Frank's been really quiet the last couple of days, huh? Hey, Frank, are you feeling okay? And what can Frank say? Frank can't say, well, you know, I just went in and started discovering about the secrets of human origins and lost megalithic civilizations. You can't do that. So instead, a lot of us have to walk this lonely road, the lonely road of truth, where we seek others like us. But in many ways, because those are so rare in the larger scheme of the masses and the populations around us still, it is a very lonely road. Would you say so, Chris?
Yeah, it is, definitely. You know, I experience it firsthand, what you're talking about. I have very few close friends that I actually live around that I can talk about this stuff with. Most of my friends live, you know, thousands of miles away online. But, you know, I am encouraged because, like I said earlier, there is a sort of awakening. People are exploring, you know, consciousness and spirituality, and where can our consciousness go? How far can this go? What are the powers of it and beyond? And especially with what's going on right now, people talking about UFOs, disclosure, you know, what's beyond us, what's beyond the stars. And you go great into our history of what could have possibly been our origins and connections to what's out there beyond the stars.
Thanks. And so I guess we're going to move into some of the topics in chapter 2. And that's essentially what chapter 2 in the Stage of Time focuses on is, well, what evidence portrays a different story about our human origins, which might seem completely mind-blowing to some people who have never heard any of this information before, because they say, well, wait a minute, aren't we just an ape? You know, aren't we just this Darwinian ape that evolved slowly and we reach here just because survival of the fittest and because we have a big brain? And consciousness, as we're taught in school, is locally created by the brain and has nothing to do with any kind of antenna or spiritual, you know, eternal energy. Those are the kinds of questions that we really have to bring to the table and start discussing, because there's so much evidence, Chris, that points to these lost civilizations that it's almost become overwhelming. And it's I feel like we're at a tipping point right now when so many other researchers as well, Brian Forster and Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch and the multitudes of other researchers that are along with those individuals who are trying to explain and say, look at all these ruins underneath the oceans off of Africa and in the Mediterranean. Look at Some of these ancient megalithic structures we find all around the world in places like South America, all the way across Easter Island into Egypt and into Turkey, and all the way through into throughout Asia. Look at all of these structures. Are they really built by the same culture or during the same time period that we're given, which is this little window of a 6,000 year time period where human civilization supposedly left from being hunter-gatherers and became more civilized? That whole story is supposed to fit in a neat little package of 6,000 years. But what happens when you get these ancient megalithic sites around the world that are being radiocarbon dated to like 11, 12,000 years, Or when you look at things like the Sphinx enclosure, the rock enclosure around the Sphinx that has clear signs of water weathering that can only happen during heavy rainfall events, which we can trace back through ice cores to not have occurred in the last 6,000 years. That means definitively that those structures were built pre 6,000 years ago, long before we're told the human civilizations were even on this planet, even reaching the point of being sophisticated. So what kind of evidence do we have? Well, I want to point out a couple pieces of evidence that actually give us some hard numbers for where to start. Now, if you come up with the idea of, you tell someone, the average person off the street, that, hey, we have an ancient human civilizations and lost civilizations can be traced back to before the last ice age, before this period that was known as the Younger Dryas, when disastrous events occurred on the planet that seemed to have wiped out civilizations all over the world and left just them turning into myths and these remnants. Well, that may seem crazy enough to some people, but we have evidence that shows that human civilizations might go back a lot further than even that. And that when we think of 12,000 years ago, that might be still somewhat recent on the geologic time scale for how far back human civilizations go. So a couple of key pieces of evidence we have comes from things like the Sumerian king list, which is then the cities that are mentioned in the Sumerian king list, which if people don't know is a cuneiform tablet from Mesopotamia that lists all the reigns in the certain cities that in Mesopotamia that were ruled. And they very explicitly state in the opening line that those were the cities that were around before the deluge, before it destroyed everything. They very, very clearly state that. But at the same time, if you add up those cities that are mentioned, and then you cross-reference them to things like the Genesis, Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Adrahasis, you can verify all of these cities that were once real, and this no longer becomes a myth any longer. And furthermore, not only do those cities go back beyond 12,000 years ago, but we have some evidence that shows they may go beyond 50,000 years ago. There was an archaeological dig that was done in central Mexico around the old Aztec empires that we see now in a site called Puebla. And in Puebla, a number of years ago, some researchers were digging down through layers of soil and deep down, because the deeper you go, the older it is. Far down in these layers of soil, which they took organic sampling to find out the ages of them based on the organic matter in those samples. And they found that way down deep in the ground, they were seeing evidence. And they when they saw this, they were like, that can't be right. And they had to go back in and recheck like 3 times. But what they found was they found remnants of civilizations that had been existing at this certain time period with tools and sophisticated civilizations with laws and morals and governing, all those things. They found at an age of 200,000 years old. And they had to do a double take, because not only does this change the 6,000 year number paradigm, but it throws everything on its head. Now, if you add up the reigns of all the kings that ruled in the Sumerian king list, you get something like 200 to 250,000 years ago, which would line up with this evidence that came out of Puebla, Mexico, showing that, well, look, we may have had the rise and fall of civilizations because of cataclysms and other events up and down for potentially even up to 200,000 years. And when you look into the origin story of mankind, where it says that Eridu was the first city ever created, and you go see this, you look at pictures of Eridu, and I highly encourage people to do it. It's so wild. After World War II, they sent some parties out there to try to find this site, and they showed pictures of research teams walking around this site, and all it is left now of the city of Eridu is this massive sand/stone area out in the middle of the desert. I mean, the middle of the desert, and there's small little remnants of building just sticking out of the sand, just like in some movie, right? And that site today, mentioned in cuneiform tablets throughout Mesopotamia as being the most important and first city ever created. That site that they've found and verified is Eridu is sitting in the desert with no one watching it, nothing roped off. You can't even visit it unless you have a tremendous amount of money and you know the right people. Why would something like that just be sitting there so that no one could care about it? If it's one of the most important historical locations ever, because that information is being suppressed and hidden, because it presents problems to our entire narrative, the entire timeline of our history, and gives us this portrayal of human origins and where kingship came from and where civilizations came from that completely rewrites and throws everything right on top of its head.
Yes, and I love that it's people, like yourself, like Brian Forrester, these independent researchers that are bringing this to the forefront of how old humanity actually could be. And not only that, but the advanced technologies that we could have possibly had and utilized to have built these megalithic and monolithic structures. Some of these things can't be recreated today.
Amazing. No, they can't. Isn't that incredible? With all the laser technology and diamond cutting tools we have, it's always said, oh, of course we could do it. But do we? Have we created any structures that have the precision of something like Pumapunku? I mean, have we seen anything that's like Tiwanaku, or anything like around Cusco, Peru, or anything like above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid of Giza, where you have more than 60-ton granite blocks that have been raised up over 300 feet around the surrounding desert to be perfectly put into place? I mean, we say we can, people claim they can, but we don't do it, and we build structures that fall down like 100 or 200 years later. Can you imagine trying to wrap our heads around remnants of a civilization that was around more than 10,000 years ago? I mean, we try to act like a couple hundred years is a lot. Just try to imagine something that's more than double the time frame that we're told that we've been around for. And so that's why I'm so passionate about this, is that when you start understanding this entire lost history that's existed before us, and how much information they knew, and how they were trying to warn us about certain mentalities and certain struggles here, like we're going to talk about with things like the eagle and the serpent, you quickly realize that there's this untold story of this struggle of human consciousness reaching higher stages of awareness versus keeping human consciousness in society in a state of complete ignorance, in this state of being blind to the world around you and what we perceive as being the true reality. And giving a quick example, when you read about and you read in the Code of Hammurabi, he mentions how Hammurabi is designated to rule over the people, but he doesn't call them just people. And I know some people have argued this quote, but I want to try to clarify it because it's important. He says in that he wants to rule over the people, the black-headed people like Shamash. Now, quickly, a lot of people would say, well, that references someone that is of a darker complexion, or someone perhaps from African roots. And I think this is all symbolic, all of it, because at the same time, we see images from Mesopotamia and in a lot of other references, even in places like the Emerald Tablets, where they mention individuals who are serpent-headed, not having a head of a serpent, but wise, extremely knowledgeable, extremely smart. So serpent-headed represents having all this knowledge and information, right? Because the serpent represented knowledge and truth. Well, at the same time, what does black-headed mean? Well, it's black-headed, meaning that they lack information and knowledge. They're ignorant. They don't have any information. So when you want to rule over them, you're talking about ruling over this population of individuals that are probably just farmers and workers and have no knowledge of any of the truth of the past or history and what this vast universe that presents themselves. And guess what? All these years later, we are in some ways in the same place, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. And, another thing that I'd love to understand about our origins, and there's so many different theories, so much misinformation, I believe, about our evolution or creation. If we, just evolved from this most tiniest microorganism, or if we were actually genetically modified at some point. It seems at some point in our history we had a huge jump in capabilities and intelligence and just knowledge about the nature of our reality, and we began to do very advanced things, it seems, all of a sudden at some point in our history.
Yeah, and there's a couple good points I want to make on this. And this is a topic we could talk about for essentially the rest of the entire discussion. But I'm going to have to keep these brief because we have a lot of areas to cover. If you want to look into human in terms of qualities that you can study and look back into our ancestry and look back into how far back some of the traits that define us and when those changed, I highly recommend people look into Lloyd Pye. He is the master when it comes to looking at human origins and all the traits that separate us from apes in the animal kingdom. And the one that is my favorite of all is the fact that if evolution is this very slow development like we've been told, and that our brain just got here because of just evolutionary means and that's it. When you actually look at the records of fossil records and you look at early humans, you find that the human brain essentially doubled in less than 1,000 years. Just doubled in size in this very short time period, which would be completely impossible and just complete isolated means if we were just this Neanderthal Denisovian that was struggling our way up through the food chain. You just see this complete change in the human brain structure in this short period of time. At the same time, Lloyd points out all these aspects of how if we were just this evolutionary outcome based on no influences at all, then why do we have so many genetic defects all throughout ridding our systems? Those would have been through Darwinism and survival of the fittest. Those traits would have died off because those individuals wouldn't have made it. We would have a situation where if that was the case, the only people that would be here would be like these perfect people that are free of all these problems. But that's not what we see. People are we're not able to really survive out in the wilds. We don't have a lot of hair. We're not that strong in comparison to things like Neanderthals. We're not really that good of runners. We don't have these qualities that you would think would be this optimal human just through evolutionary means. They're not there. It more looks like this aspect of us being tampered with and our genetics being tampered with. And Lloyd points out this great aspect that I love, which is that all primates have 48 chromosomes, meaning these clusters of genes. Human beings, though, Homo sapiens sapiens, we only have 46. That it would be, and I point this out in the stage of time, that would be completely impossible just within nature itself, because it means that at one time, two of our chromosomes were fused together. And that's an unbelievably impossible thing to just happen. Something like that could occur where we, Homo sapiens, take this huge leap out of the animal kingdom and we become this sovereign, sentient group. Now, and I want to point out another piece that sort of connects this from the ancient history side. When they did detailed studies, because I would argue that Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is probably the most studied ancient history site in the world right now, in terms of actually giving dates and being like, whoa, look at this. This is not, because a lot of these other sites are still being ignored. You're not seeing a lot of individuals deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza pointing out the great megalithic blocks above the king's chamber. They're not. But in Göbekli Tepe, you have this situation where they're doing radiocarbon dating on these soil layers as they're digging down this site that was deliberately buried, by the way, deliberately buried and sealed off to hide it, to protect it. They're digging down through these layers and they're getting dates of this site being built about 11,600 years ago, which would fall exactly in this time frame of these lost civilizations. Now, to connect this with what I'm trying to connect with human origins and the story of our past, what they found when they were digging down through these layers of Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding area was that they noticed something very strange. They noticed that alongside this sophisticated building with this advanced group there that had built that temple site where they were tracking the zodiac ages and the movement of the constellations. I mean, incredible stuff. That's what Göbekli Tepe is, these huge T-shaped pillars. They're essentially like a way to map the heavens in all the different ages. Incredible place. But anyway, what they found was, right alongside this sophistication, they found that, hey, there was hunter-gatherers. They were living in this area at one time. But all of a sudden, just like the brain size jump, when we look back and through records, we found that you see that these hunter-gatherers went from being primitive to developing agriculture and mathematics and language within just, bam, incredibly short period of time. How could that happen through natural means? At the same time, the knowledge and the information, the building styles that they had is shared essentially by all these sites around the world. And it quickly points this picture that, hey, look, they were clearly influenced by outside influences. Now, whether that is a combination of just some of these ancient groups of people who are traveling around and teaching other groups, or a combination of some of what we talk about, which is, you know, some of these ancient gods, these sky gods that are talked about, the Anunna they call themselves, or Anunnaki to the Sumerians. You know, these are just some of the aspects of what goes into this forbidden past and an understanding, you know, how did we get to where we are today?
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned the Anunnaki. That's one of the most fascinating aspects to me, is our interaction with these beings that were once called gods, and it seems that they had so much to do with the shaping of the way we see humanity now. You know, what can you tell us about these ancient beings, these gods?
Well, they're mentioned throughout not only essentially almost every single cuneiform tablet, thousands of tablets, just they talk about them constantly, but they're shared by cultures all throughout history with names that are very similar. And I can give, I'll give a very brief explanation of some of the different cultures that have used these symbols and how they've referenced them. So for instance, some of the names that are used throughout history, and we'll get into some of who they were, but some of these sky gods, you see characteristics and symbols that they share, and then you find them throughout cultures all throughout the world. In different time frames, too, different time periods. They have the same symbols for these same gods. So to give you an example, this ancient Sumerian god, Ea or Enki, we find that in cultures throughout history, as I said, you get all these different names with the exact same traits. And I'm going to briefly list some of them. In Sumer, his name was Enki. And in Akkadian, he was Ea. In Persia, he was known as Ahura Mazda. In Greece, in ancient Greek culture, he was Prometheus. And, you know, this forbidden god who gave, you know, humanity fire and knowledge. And I also think that there's connections to Poseidon as well. To the Romans, he was Neptune. To the Nordics, he was Odin. And to the Slavics, he was Veles. Now, at the same time, there's this other figure who seems to always be in competition with him back and forth, this half-brother they talk about. And his name was Enlil to the Sumerians. And in Akkadian, he was known as Elil, Angra Mainyu, Zeus to the Greeks, Jupiter to the Romans, Thor to the Nordics, and Perun to the Slavic people. So what's going on here? You know, I thought these gods were just human archetypes and they're not real, or they're just forces of nature to try to describe things. I think that those two things are going on at the same time. And that's what makes this so confusing, is that yes, some of these ancient cultures in places like the Americas, yes, they did consider the forces of nature and these different, earth, wind, fire, and water. They consider them some kind of an intelligent force relating back to this prime creator. I totally understand that. But at the same time, there are these other individuals that don't reference these elements, these forces of nature, but they're actually individuals that have conversations and have personal feelings towards certain civilizations and humans. Some of them hate human beings having higher states of awareness, and some of them find us to be an incredibly divine creation of perfection, and they want us to succeed. When you go into the Indus Valley civilizations, these ancient Hindu gods, you find out that there were these two sides of these supernatural gods who were constantly fighting. And they were known as Asuras and Devas. And the Asuras were considered these malevolent and these sort of wicked and deceptive beings, these supernatural beings, whereas the Devas were considered these beings who wanted higher states of consciousness in humanity and wanted civilizations to reach a stage where they were balanced and not focused on materialism. But this struggle seems to go on throughout history, and it seems to always come back to the Anunnaki. Every single time when you look at these ancient gods and where everything came from, it seems to stem from the idea, well, what did the cuneiform tablets say about them and about us? Well, they state very clearly, literally all of them, if you read them, they tell a very similar story, whether it's the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, the Eridu Genesis. Doesn't matter what you read. Essentially, it tells you this story about how there was once a time where we weren't here, and they came here, and they found that trying to run this world and maintain the structure of river systems and agriculture and civilizations was a burden on them. And they had essentially servants that they called the Ajiji. And they state that these Ajiji revolted. As science fiction as this story sounds, go read the Stage of Time and read the story read the Atrahasis, the cuneiform tablet that has been translated by not only the Babylonian cultures, but all the way up through the Sumerians, the Hittites. They've all translated the same story, and it's carried throughout history. But essentially, they state that there was a revolt, and they no longer wanted to do any work in this physical reality here, and that the gods essentially had to get together, and they had to create a sentient being in their image that could essentially be the physical workers in this reality. Because remember, just like these ancient writings state, there are at least 9 dimensions that in our nature or reality, but we can largely only perceive one, which is the 3rd dimension. When you go into things like meditative states, you get into places like going into 4th and 5th, but largely we're kept in this physical mortal existence here. And they state that that's why we were created in their image, which explains the genetic tampering, talks about how they molded clay using different aspects of a god's blood in humans to create this sentient being. And they wrote so that they wanted us to never forget the slain god, and they called consciousness the ghost within us, the ghost, like the ghost within the machine. And we are this mortal being that has like an antenna that can connect into these higher states of consciousness, and that we're and this is where the Gnostics really get into it. They state that we're essentially almost in like a forced reality of deception to keep us in a state where we no longer understand our divinity, but are more or less it's focused to make us believe that we're animals, so that we keep fighting to keep us in this lower state of consciousness.
Now, speaking of that, there are 2 different factions going back as far as our history goes, and it may relate to Enki and Enlil, the brothers, that they have different views of what they want for humanity, and it causes this division among humanity. And it seemed to me that Enki was the more compassionate one, at least the way I saw things. Now, tell us a little bit about these two different factions here.
Sure. And again, it seems like something right out of a movie, but the tablets state that these two supreme, powerful, whatever we want to call them, these supreme beings, as they are stated in certain texts, if whether or not you want to consider them is, your own personal belief, but whatever you want to call them, they were so advanced that they were somehow able to manipulate our reality here, and they essentially wanted to create a certain reality that we could perceive in a certain way, so that there was a type of modeled civilization and a type of modeled reality that would occur here. Now, Enki, this creator god who had been the one leading the design of us in their image, saw this as an opportunity for human beings to reach this state of becoming even greater than them. Imagine you're stuck in a cog of a certain kind of machine, right? Where you have all this group of individuals, the Council of 12, and they're all making decisions based on certain aspects that seem completely impossible to us because we live in this very structured reality where we don't really perceive all the things that are going on around us. But human beings have this potential to reach these higher states where we break out of this system here and realize, what we really are. But at the same time, there's this creative system that has been the archetypes have been working on, since Atanya and Kish after the Great Deluge. This idea of where we exist in a reality that we really shouldn't even be in, where these two gods are the reason why there's so much chaos is these two individuals are just constantly fighting. Just like the Asuras and Devas in Hindu mythology, these gods constantly fighting, never stop fighting. That's exactly the same story that is echoed in Mesopotamia with these Sumerian gods, and how they're constantly in disagreements and fighting over what kind of level of consciousness human beings should have. And the problem became the different zodiac periods that have preceded us. We're coming out of Pisces right now, have largely been governed by this Enlil figure who greatly finds the entire human experiment this debacle on the earth. And that's one of the reasons why he discusses in great detail the Epic of Gilgamesh, how they want to just wipe out all of this experiment, the mankind, and just cleanse and start over again. That's how he views us, like this failed experiment that became way too conscious and loud, meaning language and knowledge. And we became out of control, and they wanted to cleanse and start the whole thing over again. That's why I discussed the idea that these individuals seem like they're manipulating and controlling certain aspects of our reality. That's what the great challenge is with us here in this physical reality, is that there's non-physical aspects all around us that are constantly interacting and influencing our reality. So these two individuals throughout time, if you look at the earliest Mesopotamian records that show Enki and Enlil, you find these symbols. And those symbols are the eagle and the serpent. And those are the symbols they adopted to represent their specific mentalities. You could even call them in some ways duality, because one side is higher states of consciousness and light and good, and us reaching a point where we become truly sentient and aware. And then the other side is this side of control, war, keeping us in a lower state of consciousness, conscious awareness. And those two symbols have been battling throughout history. But here's the problem, Chris, and I'm sure you are well aware of this, is that some of these symbols became so prominent and essentially won this war, you could call it. The eagle, in this case, wiped out all these ancient civilizations that used to practice the serpent knowledge, that we have become ingrained in our head for thousands of years, that the eagle is this symbol of freedom, and civilizations should always adopt the symbol of the eagle because it represents us being an open society with open laws and being a sovereign state, when really the eagle represents the complete opposite of what we've been made to believe. It represents the idea of control, creating empires based on materialism and which are almost entirely war-based. You start to look at it and you go around the country and all the flags and crests throughout history, and you start to look at this alarming picture where, wow, look at all these cultures and these symbols that are shared all throughout history. But at the same time, it's like, for instance, go look at the old Russian flag, which shows this great knight essentially slaying a dragon serpent. Those types of figures and types of mentality are carried for thousands of years into the past. And they show you that there's been this underlying hidden struggle with these two sides of, you could call them our human architect sides. One where we are going to be just focusing on this physical world and empire building and money and control, whereas the other side is about energy and about reaching higher states. And those two sides are what has been this eagle versus the serpent battle throughout history. You see that all the way back to the Garden of Eden, with the serpent as this evil figure supposedly, but is tempting Eve and Adam and Eve with the knowledge of good and evil and understanding awareness, but we're made to believe that's somehow evil. And then throughout history, nearly every empire throughout history that became a war empire, they had an eagle on either their flag or their crest, almost every single one. And it's very, very telling to show you that, wow, look. So how could that be possible? Cultures across the entire world are using the same symbols to represent this struggle, and yet they're separated by vast oceans and great land masses. How could that be possible unless they were all once connected by these common influences?
Yes, it definitely seems that there used to be a worldwide, I guess you could say, culture that shared all these beliefs and this ancient knowledge and technology, and were all ruled under the same ancient gods.
That's right. And now we're at the point where this information, even though that you can go right in and read in these ancient tablets where they specifically mention the Anunnaki and the conversations that they have with some of these kings, we're made to believe that none of that's real, and that it's all just these archetypes, and that, oh, you know what, the serpent is evil and it's deceptive, and then the eagle is this figure of good. Whereas it seems like all throughout history, the heroes who have been winning all throughout have been rewriting the narrative to the point where it's so polluted that we've lost sight on every aspect of what happened in the past. For instance, like tying into that, how the ancient cultures in the Americas, all the way from the Mayan all the way down through the Aztec into the Inca, they worship the snake, the sacred serpent. And at the same time, these conquistadors that came over, the Spanish empires and Portuguese empires who came over, some of them had, their crest was the eagle, and they came over and they conquered the serpent. And look at the flag of Mexico; it shows the exact story. And I don't want to people. What about the Spanish polluted version with the this symbol of how the Aztec founded their capital city in Tenochtitlan, because they saw an eagle. It's like this great moment where when they saw that eagle eating that serpent, that would be their home. Oh, that's so beautiful. That doesn't make any sense. What do you mean? They're walking and then they see on the island, oh, look, there's an eagle eating a serpent. That's where we live. No, this is all symbolic. The whole thing is symbolic. That's not how that was founded. That's how the Spanish influences came in and rewrote all these stories so that they're all confused with what really happened. What really happened is these empires of the eagle wanted to conquer the serpent because it's part of this ancient legacy from long ago, and it's never really ended today. And that's why great empires that are still around still hold that symbol of the eagle today.
Yeah, it seems that the imagery of the serpent has been perverted so much to where people automatically associate it with something evil. Every time they see the snake, it's reptilian. It's something that to be feared. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, and all you have to do is look at St. Patrick's Day. And I know I talk about it all the time, but it is probably the best example to prove once and for all that this is all an inversion and a deception. Because think about it. St. Patrick was a Roman with the Romans were probably the #1 empire in history that had the eagle as their symbol. In fact, I don't know if people know, but the eagle to the Romans was called the agila. And when they went into battles, they would have one man's entire job was to be right in the front lines with this golden agila eagle on a staff, and he would go into battle. And when if that army was slain and they were all killed, they would send sometimes hundreds of men, great distances, and didn't matter, nothing, loss of life didn't matter. They would send in these expendable Romans to go and get that eagle back. That agila was so important to them that they would expend all these, resources and money and time to get that eagle back, because they were so obsessed with this symbol that represented them of ultimate power and control, that's what their mentality was. Now, going forward to now the story I just mentioned, St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick, his father was a Roman official, and that was part of this corrupted religious aspect where they were trying to cleanse the world of any individuals that were still focusing on this old religion, this ancient knowledge that was considered serpent wisdom. And so the proof behind that is, well, we're told that St. Patrick was simply this story of how he went to cleanse all these snakes from Ireland, and that he killed them all off, and then that it's free from snakes. It's such a silly, stupid story in my mind, and I apologize, but it's so silly that people have accepted that when there have never been any snakes in Ireland. It's so ridiculous. It's all symbolic, all symbolic. What was he really doing? Well, they were eradicating all of the Druids and pagans there. The Druids specifically, who were considered the snakes. That's why that reference to snakes and ridding the snakes comes from. They were calling them snake worshipers, or snakes as a way to speak about their belief systems, but also to label them in an evil sort of way. Because at that point, the symbol of a snake had already firmly been established as this very evil, deceptive figure associated with Satan and all these things. Which is another really funny thing too with this whole inverted side, because when you look at things like Poseidon and anything that goes back to the ancient Greek mythology, he had a trident. And then what did they do? They inverted it to show the opposite with this pitchfork figure of evil. So over and over and over again, we see that all of these aspects of our history have been inverted to the complete opposite of what they really are. And now we're in this time where it's so wonderful to see that instead of thinking that people like Columbus were heroes, we look at him more like a monster now. But that's how our history has been written by the victors, and has been portrayed in many ways in a complete opposite way.
Definitely. It is. It's very exciting to see what is happening now, with people coming to realize some of these amazing truths about our existence. Now, in the next chapter, you move beyond our planet to cosmic connections, and so little is still understood about, our space. I think that there is also a lot of intentional disinformation about what's going on beyond our planet. So let's talk about some of these cosmic connections.
Sure. Now, the first thing, and I know there's a number of people that are going to listen to this and go, space is fake. Come on, dude. Really? Space is fake?
Right.
Do you live in a city with light pollution and you can't walk outside? Go out in the countryside. I encourage anyone who's saying this, go out in the countryside, in the most dark place you possibly can, on the clearest night possible. Preferably, if you're in the northern hemisphere, do it during winter, because in my opinion, when you line up with looking at the Pleiades and Orion and Aldebaran, and it's spectacular. But the point is, you can see all of these star systems constantly in motion and moving around us. And the idea that all of that is fake is very silly to me. And I want to strongly point out that I think a lot of this is based on this psyop type of aspect, where they say, look, all these people are starting to question what we've been told because they've been lied about a lot of stuff. So let's do this. Let's just inject things like flat earth and fake space in, so that it'll just confuse everybody even more and make everybody sort of fighting back and forth with one another. But really, the problem with this whole thing is, I'm very scientific. I'm someone who does find a lot of merit in science. However, there are certain aspects from NASA and other individual institutions who have lied about key things about space. And that's the problem is, you either believe all of it or you end up going down the road where you don't believe any of it. But what about that middle road? What about that middle ground where we say, okay, I accept the fact that a lot of stuff on the moon was hidden deliberately because, well, look, they probably saw stuff up there and blah, 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 whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, there's a lot of deception that has occurred with things like certain images of the Earth, hiding certain places, I believe, around the North and South Pole specifically, hiding certain aspects of our outer solar system that would potentially cause some panic and some confusion about the ancient past of even how our solar system was developed. And that's where I want to get into now. In the Stage of Time, the last chapter, I really, really try to wrap around the idea of this term Nibiru and whether or not it was a mistranslation, and even regardless of that, and you can see my my conclusions on that if you read it, but even regardless of that term, it doesn't really matter because there's very, very strong evidence that there's another planet that exists on our outer solar system is star, okay? And this is what gets really wild. This
Matt,
is what
you froze up for a second when you said there's something in our outer solar system.
Oh, okay. I'll repeat that in case we had a little blip there. Someone's listening. There is very, very strong evidence that shows us that there are two major anomalies that exist in our outer solar system that have been deliberately hidden, that have deliberately been kept from us, so that because we have this mentality where we're told that our sun developed, billions of years ago, and then the planets developed and rotated around it, and that's the whole story. But some of the new scientific data that's coming out is giving us a completely different story now that's rewriting this and making us start to ask questions, not only about our human origins and our ancient history, how far back we go, but about how far back our solar system goes. And what is this history? What is the Mesopotamian tablets known as the Enuma Elish? What is it talking about early on with this Tiamat and all these cataclysms and all these events that occurred? Is it talking about our early solar system? What is it referring to? Well, we get some clues in a couple places. And I'm going to go backwards instead today, do something different. The newest thing that's come out is Caltech University came out and they were studying these objects that are flying around outside of our Kuiper Belt. Now, if people don't know what the Kuiper Belt is, the Kuiper Belt is an asteroid and comet field that makes our asteroid and comet field between Mars and Jupiter look like basically a baby, like a tiny, tiny little nothing. And it's not nothing, it's enormous. But this Kuiper Belt is so big that it seems to define the very outer perimeters of our inner solar system. It seems to be this barrier of our solar system is this massive, massive asteroid field and comet field called the Kuiper Belt that has something like 100 to 200 times the amount of objects that are the other field between Mars and Jupiter has. Now, what Caltech has found is they're looking at the types of elliptical orbits of different comets and objects around the Kuiper Belt. And what they found that was very startling was that those objects are being disrupted by something. Something nearby is causing them all to go off on these different paths and be wild. And what is that? Well, the newest term that's come out now is it used to be called Planet X, but now it's being called Planet 9 because of the demotion of Pluto. Now, that body was extensively discussed in the early 1980s by NASA until the Pioneer 10 probe was sent out in 1983. And once those images and that information came back, this whole thing was shut down. And you can trace it back. And that's what I tried to do in this book is I really tried to give the entire history of Planet 9 and how far back the search goes. And what's even more wild about Planet 9, right? Some people be like, big deal. Okay, so there's a planet out there. Okay. But what's even more exciting that completely puts this whole thing on its head is that Pioneer 10 didn't just find another planet. No, it found another star. It found our binary star that is actually attached and is part of our solar system. Now, it's not part of our inner solar system, but it's part of what's called a binary star system. And the wild thing is, so what evidence is there for this, right? Go look in the 1987 Science and Invention Encyclopedia, and I have the exact volume and information in the Stage of Time. You can go check that out and go look it up. But when you find out that in this 1987 encyclopedia, someone made a little bit of a boo-boo. Someone allowed this stuff to get through, and it doesn't really exist anywhere else. And what I mean by that is they included this photograph, this artistic drawing of what Pioneer 10 found. It doesn't say anything about what it found. It just shows you the picture and gives you like a portrayal, an imagery of what it found. But in the description, it should be like, if I was writing it, I'd be like, oh my God, look, Pioneer found a binary star. But it doesn't say anything, right? It just says Pioneer 10 reached our outer solar system in 1983. The following is the path of Pioneer 10. And there was also another Pioneer probe that went out that essentially didn't find anything because it went in a different direction. But in this image that's so incredible is it shows what that Pioneer called a dead star. It doesn't even say that it's like our sun, where it's this massive body of ignited material that we can observe from a distance. No, it says it's a dead star, which means it's much older. It's much older than our sun. And what that does is it puts a wrench into the entire story of our solar system. It starts to make us have to go back in and look at, well, how did this happen? Is this an invader solar system? Did it somehow get nudged just enough where it got grabbed by our sun? And that's why the Enuma Elish talks about all this turmoil. Is that why the Kuiper Belt exists? From exploded planets that crashed into each other and all this debris that was around us? We don't really know, because key individuals like Robert Harrington and Thomas Van Flandern were essentially silenced before this information could really be looked into deeper. But they essentially, before they were silenced, we could call it, from throat cancer, which seems to be always happens, right? Some kind of a cancer or suicide, is that Robert Harrington postulated with Thomas Van Flandern that this object, this Planet 9 object, has at least its entire circumference that it goes around is at least something like 10 to 20,000 years. So you see this periodic disruption to our inner solar system. And I mean inner solar system, I still mean outer, because remember, there's potentially another solar system. But what I mean by that is planets like Neptune and Uranus are showing these disruptions to their orbits. And it is showing you, basically, it's portraying this idea, just like Caltech said, where something is disrupting and tilting everything in our solar system. And it has an effect on why a lot of these events have occurred in the past.
Yes, and also there may be a connection to some of the current planetary and Earth changes that we're seeing right now. I report these Earth changes on my show, and it seems, within the past few, maybe 5 or 6 years, I've seen a major increase in some of these major events worldwide: earthquakes, volcanoes, extreme weather. It seems like every year these things are just getting gradually a little bit more intense.
Well, that's the idea, right? We're at the end of a cycle. We're at the beginning of a new cycle, and that falls exactly. That's why Göbekli Tepe in all these ancient cultures were so obsessed with the zodiac, because the zodiac is based on this 25,000 year cycle, and every single zodiac period lasts 2,100 years. And that period of time seems to go along with this rise and fall of civilizations and these events that keep occurring with the Earth. Now, I believe that they're a combination of two things. One is interactions with our solar system at a gravitational level and disrupting certain bodies because of this binary lost twin star and this planet. I think that's having an impact on the whole cycle. But at the same time, it seems like the sun has its own solar cycles that it goes through, where it can blast out these massive solar outbursts, and if it hits the right area, it can essentially wipe out entire areas. Is that what happened to Mars? Or is that something that has to do with nuclear weapons? Only one of those two things could have happened to destroy Mars. It either was a solar outburst or it was some kind of a massive nuclear event in the past. The point I'm making is those events are very real and they seem to follow these cycles. And that's what these ancient cultures were talking about. How we're in, at least the Mayan, Aztec, and others say we're at least in this third, fourth, maybe even fifth cycle of mankind, where all these other cycles have come before us and they've died out and moved to the next one. And so remember in the beginning of the show, we talked about how we're in this incredible time period right now where all this information is available. Well, that's because we're at the end of the cycle, right? This is the end. This is when everything comes out, when it seems like at the end of every cycle, you get this massive change in consciousness. And if society doesn't make certain changes and decide on certain decisions, they get potentially wiped out. Whereas at the other side, if they can reach a balanced state of living with the world around them, maybe these cycles changes aren't always exterminations. Maybe it depends on a lot of factors. And I know when I talk about this, a lot of people cringe thinking about the idea of the world ending or us in this type of mentality where everyone's going to be killed right now. I don't think that that's anywhere necessarily like the case in this example, because we don't have an ice age right now like they had 12,000 years ago when all these disastrous events occurred. And we don't have the same types of effects that are going on. We have technology that potentially we're using to prevent this. Is that why there's so much secrecy around the North and South Pole? When Admiral Byrd flew over the North Pole, is that why he saw strange stuff? Are they well aware of these events occurring where the sun and potential outer planetary bodies affect the Earth so much that the Earth's poles just rapidly shift and then you get all these disasters? Is that so well known is that why that the Pentagon, the black budget stuff that happened before 9/11, is that why all those billions of dollars just disappeared into the black budget because they were building some kind of underground facilities because they knew? These are questions that we really need to ask, because when you look into those types of events, the United States was right before 9/11 was missing billions, if not trillions of dollars missing. They were like, where did it go? And all that money was being housed in those towers. All right. And then so those towers went down and were destroyed. And oops, all those records were destroyed. Let's put that aside for now and let's go focus on the war on terrorism. And that's exactly what happened. And meanwhile, all these secrets just continue with all this stuff being built and all these things that are happening on the background. I mean, just look up in the sky. It's turned into total insanity. And I don't want to get on my soapbox box too much, but please, I beg of people, please just study basic clouds. Please just learn what a cumulus cloud is, what cirrus is, and what stratus is, your three basic types. And then just notice these long veils that are being sprayed across the sky that just conform and turn to these massive milky clouds. How is that a contrail? How can a contrail, which is just simple vapor in the air at a high altitude, which dissipates within 1 minute, how are those creating these massive clouds all over the sky? And furthermore, for us to be duped in this mentality that we all accept that those are just contrails and we're just ignoring all this stuff going on above us. I mean, I just want to scream to the world, look at what they're doing, because, well, one, they're doing it potentially to help us, but two, they're doing it in this means where they may be hiding all these other types of substances within those chemtrails that are unhealthy for us and potentially keeping people in a certain state, while also reflecting particles back into space to try to prevent pole shifts because they don't want the system to crash and burn here, right? Like we've seen here, Chris. So there's a lot going on right now. Like you mentioned, there are volcanoes and earthquakes going off all over the world. We just had a 7.0 in Philippines yesterday. And people are just going about their lives acting like this is normal. When we have something, and you can probably speak onto this, earthquakes within the last 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is, are something like a 100 or 200% what they normally are or something. And
Yeah, since 1900, it's actually up. I think the number was around like 2,000%, some ridiculous amount since
just
1900.
normal every day, right? Just normal
Right,
stuff.
yeah. And, normally there's about 20 to 30 volcanoes erupting at one time. Recently, we've had numbers of up to 50, 70, sometimes 80 volcanoes on alert or erupting at the same time.
That's like 3 times as many.
Yeah, it's some of the things are getting really intense, and especially with the worldwide weather. I'd reported a story earlier of hail almost, over baseball size, just ridiculous storms and floods, disasters that are majorly underreported as well.
Yeah, and I think that as these zodiacs change, they're probably coinciding with these changes that go on in our solar system, with our sun, with our planet. Everything is related. So we're moving into this time when we're going from, and you can look at scientific data right now, this is starting to become a real focus, is that look at the wobbling of the North Pole right now. Okay, it's a real problem. Inuit hunters can't use the stars to navigate anymore. Everything is shifted. It's mainstream news now that our North Pole is shifting so dramatically that they're constantly having to fly up there and find it again. How can we not be concerned about this? This didn't used to happen. We haven't had this wobbling like this. So when you see these earthquakes that are happening in volcanoes that are happening at record levels and all these changes, how can we not correlate those? How can we not connect those events to see that they're part of the same process? And what is that process? Well, I believe just at least looking at solar aspect wise, not even looking at the idea of potentially the outer planets and binary star impacts, but just solar wise, it seems that the sun goes through solar maximums and minimums somewhat regularly, maybe 12,000, 20,000 years it seems to happen. And every time that occurs, the same thing happens. The Earth, when it goes from a solar maximum to a solar minimum, which is where we are right now, we're in a solar maximum. That's why it's so hot. We're going from a solar maximum to a solar minimum. You want to make that clear. And when that happens, you always get an ice age. Always get an ice age, which means we are entering this time period when I don't know if it's within our lifetime or when it is, but within the next 100 to 200 years, you will see a change. We will see this change here when we will start shifting over. Now, it may be a much quicker change than people realize, because what controls the global weather on the planet is the sun. And what controls the weather in terms of the sun's impacts here are currents. Now, when currents shift, like the Gulf Stream current that feeds up from off of Florida and it goes all the way over to Scandinavia and keeps places like Spain 20 degrees warmer than they should be, those types of locations, if you were to get an influx of too much fresh water, which just seems like it happens every single time and it's part of this cycle, that seems to be what triggers us going into an ice age. Is you get a shutdown of these currents, and then all of a sudden you see this flip. Is that what's happening right now? Is that why the North Pole is wobbling, and why they're spraying the skies year after year, like constantly, are they trying to prevent this impending disaster that's on? Now, I think that they're going to largely be successful. I really do. I'm very optimistic, because I think these responses we're seeing with earthquakes and volcanoes and climate changing and shifting is our Earth being affected by these changes right now as we talk. We're having an effect, but I think certain technologies being used, like geoengineering, which are known as SAIs, stratospheric aerosol ejections, technology at the poles. They probably used a bunch of old Nikola Tesla technology or something, and what they're doing is they're essentially trying to prevent this event by creating a global conspiracy so that people don't even realize that any of it's happening. Try to wrap your head around that, right? Most people have no idea that any of this is happening. They have no idea what's going on above their heads spraying. They have no idea about these earthquakes and volcanoes. When they see something like extreme weather, it's just climate change based on just simple man-made activity, and that's it. And it's so much more complicated than that. It goes into so many more levels than that.
Yeah, and people's cognitive dissonance keeps them from researching further into some of these things. Lots of times when you tell them about it, they immediately dismiss it and say, you're just a tinfoil hat wearing
That's the term, right? To label
yeah, of
us.
course. But like we said earlier, that it is encouraging what's happening right now. More people are kind of waking up. I'm talking to more people that are realizing these things than ever before. So it is encouraging, and I think that we are living probably in one of the most important times of our human history. When it comes to these amazing events that are happening right now, from the crazy earth changes that we're seeing, to the rise in people's consciousness, to the disclosure of UFO information, and then people like yourself uncovering our hidden history. It's really a fascinating, wonderful time, I think.
This is an incredible time to be here, and I love that we can just have these conversations. It's obviously frustrating to me. It's hard not to go out into the society and not want to just get a loudspeaker and just start screaming over it like some crazy person. But we can't do that. And so as exciting as it is to have these conversations with you and have other like-minded individuals, at the same time, it's very frustrating with the overwhelming amount of evidence that I try to tell people about, even people that are really intelligent. I'm like, please go read one of these tablets. Please go look at some of this evidence. And it's like, la, 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 la. It's like they don't want to hear it. Please just, okay, I'm aware of that exists, but I don't want my paradigm shattered, right? And so this is a very interesting time when it's a war on information. It's a war on keeping people their attention focused on something, and I think that's what we're in right now. This exciting time is the great darkness before the dawn, and I encourage people to be optimistic because this isn't a sad time. No, we're at the end of the darkness. We're about to enter a new and completely brand new age in humanity, and we just need to make sure that we have the tools necessary to be able to move to that new age.
Yes, definitely, Matt. Fascinating stuff as usual. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. And you are one of my most returning guests. So, of course, we're going to have you on again soon.
Thanks, Chris. I love talking to you. We always have great discussions. I always appreciate it. For those interested, please check out my website at thestageoftime.com and my YouTube page at Mathieu LaCroix. LACROIX. You can find links to some of my recent books. And on my website, there are translations if you don't have any money and you can't afford the book. My website, The Stage of Time, has all kinds of translations from these tablets with the history behind them and some photographs. So I just want people to be able to go look at this for themselves, have their mind blown, and have reality look different than it's ever looked before.
Definitely. I'll leave the links to all that in our description. Matt, thank you again, and you have a great rest of your night.
You too, Chris. Thanks.